In the last few years, there's been quite a lot of amazing developments in the enthusiast retro gaming scene. Controller adapters, mod kits for playing backups, and most notably, upscaling boxes and console mod kits for high quality digital video output. I mean, come on, why would one even think to limit themselves to CRTs? There's just so many options for playing games upscaled to HD, with sharp pixels, little to no lag, and compatibility with nearly every console under the sun. After all, CRTs are big, heavy, loud, and blurry, just generally more hassle than they're worth. I don't blame you for thinking that. There's a reason why we left them behind in favour of modern flat panel displays. But when it comes to retro games, I don't think it's that cut and dry, at least not entirely. Even with upscalers, there's several downsides to them that render them quite impractical or awkward to use. CRTs still just make the most sense for retro games, up until about the 6th generation or so. In this video, I'm not just going to tell you why CRTs look the best for retro games, but I'm also going to try and make the case for why their advantages in lag, as well as cost effectiveness and convenience, to a point, can make them worth it for even the average retro gamer. If you've not had one for a long time, or at all for that matter, I probably won't make you a believer right away. I mean, even I can admit they got a few glaring problems that I can't entirely ignore. But if you like what you see, and are willing to keep an open mind, then keep watching. You might just find something to love about the big, loud, heavy boxes that define the childhoods of millions of gamers, including myself. So join me. Let's connect the phosphor dots and read between the scan lines as we dive into why you should at least consider a CRT for your retro gaming setup. So let's start with the first and most obvious reason as to why you'd want to use a CRT for pre-HD systems, the picture. But before we can understand the picture, we must first analyse the way LCDs and CRTs work. I'm aware of other types of screens like Mini LED and OLED, but for the sake of time and because LCD is still the most common type of flat screen, that's what I'll primarily be comparing CRTs to. Quick note before we continue, by the way, I'm largely ignoring PC CRTs since that's a bit outside the scope of this video. This video is primarily focused on home consoles plugged into standard consumer television sets. A liquid crystal display is essentially a light shining through a series of filters. The pixel layer is controlled by a computer and forms the picture based on the signal it receives. These picture elements are quite literally the building blocks of the image, with an average screen having 1,920 of them horizontally and 1,080 vertically. A pixel is actually a combination of 3 sub-pixels, which can be controlled independently of each other, usually made up of red, green, and blue. When viewed from a far enough distance, your brain blends them together to make them look like one colour, so the red and blue sub-pixels make magenta, the blue and green make turquoise, and so on. When the display receives a signal, it knows exactly where each pixel is supposed to go, and so uses the computer and the rest of the display circuitry to light up each pixel with the appropriate colour, from top to bottom, left to right, producing a coherent image. By contrast, the humble cathode ray tube is a bit dumb in comparison. It has no computer inside it, at least not to drive the picture itself. It'll have one for the on-screen menus, but that's about it. In fact, forget about computers, there aren't any pixels either. Instead, there's but a single point of light being flung about the screen, changing colours at the right time and place in accordance with the video signal. As the beam sweeps across the screen from top to bottom, left to right, it lights the phosphor dots in such a way that just so happens to produce a coherent image. Persistence of vision, or the natural motion blur in our eyes, sees this fast-moving light and blends it together to make it look like the whole screen is lit up at once. A quick note about phosphor dots. While they may look a bit like pixels, these are not pixels. They're actually a side effect of the way the technology works, specifically because of something called a shadow mask. It's a sheet of metal that sits between the electron guns and the front glass, separating the beams up so that they don't converge and create a black and white image instead. As a result, this creates effects like the scan lines sitting halfway between dots, while the diffuseness of the light creates a slight vertical gradient towards the light's cutoff point, and even a slight bit of bleed into adjacent dots. By contrast, pixels are driven by active circuitry, have hard edges that can't bleed into each other, and can only be lit wholly, rather than halfway up or down a subpixel. I'd recommend you watch these videos by Technology Connections if you want more depth, but suffice to say, these aren't pixels. They don't work the same, nor do they produce the same visual results. You might say, but I can see the pixels on a CRT, and while you're not wrong per se, you're just seeing an analog representation of those pixels. The console needs to convert the pixel-based digital video signal it generates into a voltage-based analog signal before it gets sent to the TV for output. The console is working with pixels, but the display itself is not. The point is that these technologies obviously work in very different ways, and the results are worth more than anything I could write about their technical differences. If you're not used to the way CRTs look and are more accustomed to sharp pixels through an emulator, you may say to yourself, but the LCD is so much sharper and clearer than the CRT, to the point where you can see every little pixel. And honestly, that's half the problem, at least for some people. While it's true that games can look nice on an LCD with sharp pixels, some people, like myself, prefer the softer picture since it can give a more rounded, organic appearance to pixel art. It doesn't get rid of the pixels, but it certainly makes them less visible, and if you're not looking too hard from a normal viewing distance, the CRT can mask flaws in pixel graphics very well. I like the sharp pixel look, don't get me wrong, but there's something about the tube's softer picture and the way it smooths over pixel art that I prefer just a little bit more. There's also the matter of 240p, which can often wreak havoc with newer displays. 240p itself isn't exactly a proper video standard like 480i was. Instead, it was actually a hack of sorts, made to work around the limitations of early video game consoles. I'm simplifying here, but all you need to know is that 240p and 480i are basically the same signal, with the difference being that 240p draws the lines in the same place instead of shifting between fields like 480i. So if you hook a 240p console into a TV, especially one contemporary to the 8th generation, it's more than likely misinterpreting 240p as 480i than trying to de-interlace that misidentified signal. Though that assumes the TV will show anything at all with 240p, which many will not. They were made to process VHS tapes and DVDs after all. You can see this in places where an object flashes rapidly, usually done to simulate transparency, where they'll turn into split up lines like this instead of flashing. This TV in particular, a Panasonic TX30LX D80A, that's a bloody mouthful, doesn't do this 100% of the time, even in the same game. Here in the first stage, the pigs flash completely normally when they get hit. However, this part of the game also shows that objects blur and flicker a bit in motion, another effect of the TV mishandling the signal as interlaced. And that's to say nothing of the Mega Drive's notorious composite video artifacts, which clean up wonderfully on a CRT. But considering what the TV was designed for, I think the results here, while not the most pleasing thing in the world, are certainly passable. But that's not going to be the case for every TV with every system. It'll vary wildly, especially with TVs into the mid-2010s that started introducing so many different ways to ruin, enhance the image. For lots of Mega Drive games, there's a common trick called dithering, checkerboards of similar colours across an expanse of pixels, creating the illusion of a higher colour depth when blended together by the tube. It can also be used with alternating solid and transparent pixels to create the impression of transparency. It's so common on the system that many say the Mega Drive should only be played with RF or composite video on a CRT, and while I disagree with that, I can certainly see where they're coming from. Dithering is also common in plenty of 5th gen games, since color depth was still posing such restrictions, and playing them on a CRT can help blend it together, making the image feel a little bit cleaner. There's also the matter of contrast. You might not know it, but this black screen coming from your phone, PC monitor or TV is outputting light, even though there's nothing on it. LCDs have a backlight right at the rear of the panel that shines through all the layers between it and the outside glass or plastic. The light for the pixels needs to come from somewhere after all. CRTs, on the other hand, don't have this problem, since the light turns completely off when there's a black spot on screen. So even though modern LCDs, especially IPS panels, can sometimes appear brighter than CRTs, the tube's deeper blacks, subtle halo around bright objects and different colour rendering give a more vibrant impression to the image. It's not the kind of thing that's meant to blow your mind at every corner with how colourful everything looks, it just adds a lot of subtle flourishes to games that would otherwise look a bit flat. Stars in space have a more natural glow, detailed scenery is given more depth, and bright, cartoony art styles have more pop than they ever did on an LCD. And finally, the scanlines, that famous cherry on top which completes the signature look. Whether those scanlines are progressive or interlaced, their separation adds a layer of texture to the image in a way that's really hard to describe. Just like the blur, the scanlines can also help in hiding some imperfections, but they, along with the phosphor dots, can also create details that aren't really there. A good example that showcases this is Dracula from Symphony of the Night. Check out how the blur and the composite video artifacts create a more natural glow to Dracula's eye, rather than his goofy red dots with sharp pixels. The scan lines combine with the blur to give more definition to Dracula's lips and even the folds of his clothing, which look blobby with sharp pixels. I'm also not the biggest fan of the way they render his hair either. It almost looks like, I don't know, chalk. The CRT helps to give it a more natural looking texture. What's interesting is that the CRT actually isn't contributing any extra details to the signal. If anything, it's taking detail away through the blur and the scan lines. But the rougher looking result gives more room for the mind to interpret how it's probably supposed to look. For instance, his bottom lips kind of look like teeth on a CRT, don't they? The flaw in this Phantasy Star 4 battle scene is another great example of the CRT creating a false impression. The scan lines, blur and phosphor dots can almost convince you that there's rich, microscopic detail on the ground, finer than the pixels themselves, even though there isn't. CRTs can kind of be like a paradox in that sense, where presenting the player with literally fuzzier visual information can make them fill in the gaps in their head. And when the player engages with the game's presentation in such a way, they're going to fill the blanks with whatever they come up with, which will be different from person to person, especially since all of them would have grown up with different TVs, with different phosphor dots, and at different picture settings. And I feel it's these interpretations of what it might look like based on the particular impression created on their CRT that people remember from their childhoods. And I feel it's often the reason why some people say to themselves, "This looks worse than I remember," even if they're using an emulator on a high-res flat panel with sharp pixels. If you were a kid in the 90s before you ever saw pixel art or official concept art, and this is what you were familiar with, then you could imagine why you'd play it on a modern screen and feel like something was off. There's a few convincing CRT filters for emulators like CRT Royal, but it's still not the same as the real thing, and honestly, even showing you the real thing on camera is doing it a disservice. It begs to be seen in person. The point is that every single little quirk about the CRT matters, from the scan lines to the phosphor dots that come in different shapes and sizes, the color reproduction, the contrast and the blur. It all needs to be there to complete the look of the CRT. And it's this collection of little illusions that all add up to make the tube's effects what they are. And there's one generation in particular that, if you ask me, shows the biggest disparity between CRTs and modern flat panels, the 6th generation. The GameCube, Xbox, Dreamcast and especially PS2 don't look conventionally sharp when upscaled from their most common native resolution of 480i. The Dreamcast largely mitigates this since basically all of its library runs in 480p, and most of the ones that don't by default can be forced with minimal effort. The GameCube and Xbox have a large chunk of games that support 480p, though not all of them do, and as far as I'm aware, it's a bit spottier than the Dreamcast when trying to force it. Though it's still usually worth trying, especially if you're a PAL GameCube owner, since there is no PAL GameCube game with 480p, including my home country of Australia. For us, any 480p options are usually replaced with a 50 or 60Hz toggle on boot up. But when you find a game that works with 480p, then the results can be a lot nicer than 480i, especially on a flat panel display. The PS2, on the other hand, has most of its library stuck at 480i, and while there are ways to force 480p in a few games, for the most part it frustrates more than it delivers. There are some notable exceptions. Heavy hitters like Tekken 5, Guitar Hero 3 have 480p support, but only on NTSC versions. Thankfully, it's not like the GameCube where 480p was just inexplicably absent from the whole library, but when it comes to PS2, 480p on PAL is but a fraction of the already small pool of 480p games. A few PS2 favourites like Destroy All Humans 1 and 2, Resident Evil 4 and Outrun 2 all support 480p on PAL, but when there's only about 50 other games that support 480p on PAL, it's clear that you'll have to take what you can get. That is, if you're concerned about a clean, progressive image on a flat panel. Seeing 6th gen games on a CRT, even in interlaced modes, is a treat. The CRT's omnipresent softness helps to hide how blurry some 6th gen games could be, especially PS2 games, which take on an otherworldly look on a CRT, appearing crisp yet smooth at the same time, even in 480i. Though I will say that this Panasonic does pretty good deinterlacing for PS2 games. It's not perfect, and I can still see some issues here and there, but on the whole, it's honestly pretty good. But still, resolution is only half the battle. Even when I'm emulating a 6th gen game in HD, it still doesn't compare to the way CRTs represent them. There's just something really flat about the way 6th gen games look on an LCD, flatter than even 4th or 5th gen games can look sometimes. This was the first generation where developers could properly hone their game's colour palette without bending or dithering, and because of this, games took on a much more muted appearance. Even some of the most colourful games of the generation didn't venture into saturated colours as was so previously common. But because CRTs have deeper colours than even the most vibrant LCDs, they actually look quite a bit more natural. A great example is Crash to Insanity. This game looks horrifically dull on an LCD. All the colours are flat, nothing stands out much, and the water looks more like a vague suggestion than something in the environment. Okay, I'm being a bit harsh, it doesn't actually look too bad on its own, but as soon as you put it next to the CRT, its issues become pretty apparent. Even the brightest and most colourful of PS2 games like Ape Escape 2 don't come away unscathed, and when you put it on a CRT, it shines in comparison. However, that kind of disparity can vary, and some games have a less dramatic transformation than others. Sonic Riders, especially the GameCube version shown here, actually looks really nice on a flat panel, especially in HD, but even still, the way it's done on the CRT makes me prefer it just a little bit more. And that pattern continues across the gamut of 6th generation games across all systems. Pac-Man World 2 kinda has that Ape Escape problem where it almost needs a CRT to look its best, but Mario Sunshine still looks great on an LCD, even if it instead looks absolutely stunning on a CRT. I could go on and on. There's so many little examples like this where the CRT brings 6th gen games to life. Even some of the games with more grounded art styles like San Andreas, Ridge Racer 5, etc. are all pretty good on an LCD, but look amazing on a CRT. And not only will they look great, they'll play great too, since the CRT is the best in the business when it comes to input lag. LCDs are digital in nature, which means processing time, which means input lag. If you're playing modern games on modern systems like a PS5 or a Switch on a modern screen, then you may not pay any mind to lag. The signals they send, usually 1080p to 4K signals at 60Hz, don't have much intensive processing done to them, so they get displayed quickly. But when it comes to retro games, especially if you just plugged something straight into your TV via composite, there's going to be quite a few issues. I've already mentioned the deinterlacing process, but even if your TV does it well, it probably still won't be the best for lag, because of the time it took for the TV to scale and deinterlace the signal in the first place. Even the fastest of modern TVs still have a couple frames of lag. But again, it seems to be TVs made into the 2010s that you want to worry about the most, since that's around the time when TV companies started introducing all sorts of other image processing techniques that usually just plain suck for both image quality and lag. I remember one TV in particular at an old friend's house, and how even playing a SNES Classic in 720p produced unacceptable lag, to the point I couldn't even play anything on it, at least with its default settings. You can certainly fix this with game mode or something like it on said TVs that disables these effects, giving you something that looks much nicer and eliminates nearly all of the lag, but even the best of LCDs still aren't quite as good as CRTs in terms of lag. It might only be a 2 or 3 frame difference, but in some games you can really feel it. Once again, we seem to have gotten the real luck of the draw with this Panasonic, since it actually has little to no lag. I mean, it passed the crazy taxi test with flying colours. Yes! Look at that! That's not often that happens. Oh, look at that. You'll love to see it. I literally can't emulate this game on PC because those few extra frames make the game's advanced mechanics like the dash and the drift feel so much stickier than they already are, so to see the Panasonic do so well is remarkable. I even made the TV deinterlace 1080i just to make it extra unfair, and it still crushed it like a champ. You know, I completely forgot that this was supposed to be just a lag test. This TV is from 2008 and seems to lack any image processors that would later become notorious in the 2010s for ruining image quality and latency. Things like motion interpolation, vivid color settings, and all these other things that gamers just don't need enabled on their TVs. Put it like this, LCDs have perfectly acceptable lag when put in game mode and using a signal that they can upscale and process quickly. But while the results are generally pretty good for this TV in particular, there's enough variance between different TVs that I'm not entirely comfortable with the idea of replacing the CRT with a flat screen should the need arise. CRTs are the kind of thing that people use in tournaments and at speedrunning events, since when a CRT is in use, the only lag that exists is because of the game or the hardware. I don't necessarily need the CRT's few less frames of lag, but I'd personally prefer to have one around, just as a peace of mind sort of thing. To be honest, I was amazed that I didn't have as many bad things to write about this TV as I thought I would. What was already a very nice LCD for watching TV with is now something I could conceivably game on without much issue, even without an upscaler. Gotta say, not bad for a hand-me-down from the grandparents, eh? Though that still doesn't solve its other problems, things you can't fix with a menu, like really visible composite artifacts, comparative lack of color and dynamic range, etc. Also, just as a quick aside, another thing I don't like about LCDs is their complete lack of light gun compatibility. This one is a rather personal point, but I just want an excuse to talk about this, and I'm not sure when I'm going to be able to do it again. But I think it's a good thing to mention anyway, since the CRT can open the gates to some of the greatest arcade light gun games out there, especially classics on the PS1 and 2 like Time Crisis 2, Vampire Knight, and Point Blank. LCDs can't work with light guns at all, and the reasons I've heard about are often really contradictory and don't exactly provide clarity. But near as I can tell, some combination of a few frames of lag and the type of light LCDs produce makes light guns incompatible with them. I'm sure the reasons vary between different display types as well as the particular light guns themselves, but the point is, none of them work on flat screen displays. Which is a damn shame if you ask me. Being able to play some of these for the first time has been an absolute treat to say the least. Half the reason I got this tube, some 5 years ago now, was because I wanted to play some of these light gun games one day, and now that I have, I can say it was absolutely worth the wait, especially Vampire Knight and Time Crisis 2. Like, seriously, having a CRT around just for these games is so worth it if you ask me. I mean, hell, even my niece and nephews get a real kick out of it. But anyway, we're here at the last two reasons why you might want to own a CRT, and it's these last two that I feel really tie all these other reasons together, even if, ironically, they're the ones with the most strings attached to them. So to understand why I, for the moment at least, haven't invested in upscalers, cables and switches, you must first get acquainted with my current console collection. I own, from oldest to newest, a Mega Drive, Saturn, PS1, N64, PS2, Xbox, Xbox 360, and Wii. Let's be cynical for a bit and assume that I wanted to hook all of these up at once to a flat screen using a RetroTink 5X with the highest quality cables and switches. I'd need 3 SCART cables, 3 sets of component cables, an S-video cable, and at least 2 switches. And when you tally all this up, it can get very expensive very bloody quickly. You can cheap out on this quite a bit with a more basic upscaler like the 2X Mini and replace SCART with S-Video, which isn't as good as SCART, but is still quite the jump over composite or RF. But some systems like the Mega Drive, NES and PC Engine don't work with S-Video natively, requiring a mod of some kind. And considering most of us would have to enlist the service of an experienced modder for such things, it can sometimes add a bit too much cost and headaches to the matter, more than what I'm willing to deal with right now at least. And that's to say nothing of digital video mods for the PS1, N64, Dreamcast, etc. Essentially, they're mod chips that adapt the console's native digital video signal and scale it up to a desired resolution over HDMI, and they're pretty cool, but still carry the associated headaches with mod chips in general. There's all that versus the official packed-in cables at no extra cost into a passive composite switch I got for $4 at the tip shop, straight into a tube that I got from a friend's mum's friend for free. All in all, this setup basically costed me all of $4, and it looks so good. To be fair, the switcher limits me to 4 systems at a time, but I don't play all of them all the time anyway, mainly just the PS2 and the 360 at the moment. I would like to use my Wii for emulators as well as GameCube games, but it seems to have that issue where the screen just starts going dark and or flickering a lot due to an aging capacitor in the noise filtering circuit, at least that's my guess. That plus my N64 and Saturn are in ambiguous states of functionality, like an electronic Schrodinger's cat. So being a bit more fair to the RetroTink, limiting it to my 3 most used systems, the PS2, Wii, and 360, it does become a lot more reasonable. But I only want my collection to expand, not shrink, and as I buy more and more systems, the prices for the cables and switches are only going to climb. But even still, if money was no object to me and I could buy all of this expensive stuff at once without a care in the world, it'd still kinda be a waste of money, since they'd primarily be for capture duty. I'd love to own all this expensive gear to one day take the channel to all real hardware recordings from high quality upscalers, but I'm not getting there for a while yet. And I don't really need to get there for a while, since if I want high quality captures, I have a bunch of emulators sitting right there to use with OBS at a moment's notice. And when it comes to just sitting down and playing games, I don't need nor want to game with any upscaler, since I just prefer the way CRTs look, full stop. So either way you slice it, upscalers just don't serve a purpose for me, at least not right now. If I purchased a cheap upscaler like the 2X Mini tomorrow, it'd go unused, and it wouldn't make sense to throw away rent money to the 5X and a good capture card, when I could just keep using OBS, at least for the time being. And this is what I mean when I say that CRTs just make the most sense. I have to be very frugal and pragmatic when it comes to my setup. I can't spend too much money, and I also don't want it to be too complicated. And considering the warm, vibrant picture, no lag, surefire compatibility with older systems, cheapness, and convenience, CRTs just intersect with what I want out of my setup the most. And when I say convenience, I mean the convenience of using the tube itself. Because this thing is only a 20-inch screen, but the whole set is about the size of this tiny little cabinet it's resting on, or like, I don't know, 4 mid-sized desktop towers put side by side. And with that size comes a lot of weight, with even this screen being a hefty 25 to 30 kilos or so. And since almost all of that weight is localized in the front glass, it can be tricky to carry around. I don't have to worry about this much since we don't move too often and I don't have a lot of stuff to move around anyway, so whenever the need arises, it's not too hard to make the time and space for it. But whether you can is another story entirely, and it's why I said that there's a few asterisks next to these. Because while it's convenient to just plug a system straight into a CRT and get going with a good picture straight away, that convenience could potentially evaporate if you can't have such a big, heavy box sitting around. In which case, these advantages I mentioned might not be enough for some of you to consider getting a tube TV if it's just straight up impractical for you. When I say CRTs make the most sense, that obviously doesn't go for absolutely everybody, especially if you're already happy with your flat screen and or can't find the strength and space to put a CRT in your home. And that's to say nothing of the process of finding one, buying one, covering shipping costs, or driving somewhere potentially for hours if they're scarce in your area. For the first time in literally forever, I managed to find some local listings on Facebook Marketplace for some good prices, with a couple popping up for $50 and $60 each, but that's about it. If you live in a larger, more densely populated area, then you're pretty in luck. You can generally find one in good condition for $50 to $150, and it shouldn't be too far away either. I, however, do not live in a dense area, so should I ever need to replace this tube, I'm looking at waiting around a lot for local listings on Facebook or Gumtree, or as a last resort, I'd have to pay for shipping on eBay. Which, if you can help it, please don't do this. The TVs can easily break in shipping, and it just generally seems to cause more headaches from what I've seen and read about. And while it won't be conventionally cheap, it won't break the bank either, and it'll always be cheaper than all of this gear. Though no amount of money can get rid of the CRT's noise. A 15 kHz vibration from a coil of wires called the deflection yoke that sits at the back of the tube and is what moves the beam of light around the screen. When a CRT is running in 240p or 480i mode, it's drawing roughly 15,770 scan lines every second, which is where the 15 kHz sound comes from. Though really, once the game is running and you're listening to the sound and music, you basically never notice it. It's only noticeable during a long-ish period of silence. That is, if you're young enough to even hear it at all. If you've got the space and you can get your hands on one, the CRT can make quite a lot of sense for those looking to get the most out of their retro games without spending lots of time and money. And I think that for lots of people, the CRT can strike a perfect balance in aspects that matter to most people: good picture, low lag, and ease of use. Especially for me, the CRT is what completes my console gaming setup. Without it, San Andreas looks too bare, Crash 2 isn't vibrant enough, and I'd never be able to even play Time Crisis 2. It is, without a doubt, my favourite part of this setup. It serves as the cherry on top, solidifying my immersion in any game I play, whether it's 2D, 3D, bright, dark, colourful, monotone, cartoony, realistic, it doesn't matter. The CRT can put a lovely bow on all of these games. And once I got the tube, all I needed to do was plug it in and turn it on to get a vibrant picture with little to no lag, and it didn't cost me an arm and a leg to do it. I'm 22 years old, and in my 19 to 20 odd years of gaming, I've only been without a CRT for 4 of those years. I got my first flat screen in 2014, this exact NEC NLT 19WG, which itself is actually a very nice monitor from the same year as this Panasonic TV, with a lot of similar advantages. I got it because I wanted to play my 360 games in HD, since I couldn't read the text in a bunch of them, as well as being influenced by a youthful, optimistic desire to keep up with modern technology. It's actually even better for 240p than the Panasonic, since this monitor applies naught but a soft Bob D interlace, which essentially creates the appearance of a simple and clean 240p upscale with no motion blobbiness or split lines. This monitor also has S-Video, VGA, and even SCART on board, so I have no shortage of options, and I can get a pretty nice picture, especially if I were to standardize my consoles on S-Video and SCART. But even as a kid, I knew what I was in for. I knew it wasn't going to look as good for retro stuff, and I knew I'd miss my CRT's comparatively good sound as well. I was 13 at the time, and knowing full well I'd need to convert HDMI to VGA to get it displaying in HD, and the fact that composite cables had bandwidth limitations, I still somehow thought that hooking it up with the composite cables I had would at least result in a picture somewhat clearer than my CRT. Why I went through with it as eagerly as I did is anyone's guess really, despite already knowing that the screen isn't the end-all and be-all of video quality. Needless to say, I regretted tossing my last childhood tube as quickly as I did, and ever since that day, I'd always yearned to get another one. Not because I hated using the flat screen, I stuck with it, and I still use it today as one of my PC monitors, and I'm honestly quite happy with it despite its low resolution. But one faithful day in 2018, I was visiting a friend's house, and I overheard a conversation between his mum and her friend about an old TV she was looking to get rid of. I asked her friend, "Oh, is it one of those old boxy TVs, the ones that are really deep?" And sure enough, it was, and I asked her if I could take it off her hands. About a week or two later, it was dropped off at the front door of the house, and I hauled it in myself without much hassle. If the name DSE is unfamiliar to you, that's probably because you're not Australian. This particular set was sold by Aussie electronics retail chain Dick Smith Electronics, which went defunct in 2016, and for a long while, they focused on import goods from Asia. This TV is from the 2000s and is more than likely one of these OEM devices that Smith was so infamous for in this country. So this TV isn't only a great gaming display, but also a wonderful time capsule, one that serves as a reminder of where the Aussie electronics industry was circa 2004. It's no Sony Trinitron or Toshiba, but for what it is, it's pretty good, and really, even the most average or subpar of CRTs such as this one can still look much nicer for retro games than a flat screen. I'll be honest, writing this video has been pretty hard because there's so much more I could potentially go on about with regards to the venerable Cathode Ray Tube. But I feel like I've given you the gist of what makes these so special and why they're so coveted in this day and age. There is one thing that bugs me about CRTs though, and that's their potential longevity. I dread the day that this tube does eventually decide to die on me, but while I'm not too worried about that in the short term, I am worried about it in the long term. There's only so many working ones left, especially after everyone got rid of their old TVs that either stopped working, or just left for dead in a landfill after they got a flat screen to keep up with the Joneses. So if my tube were to die on me tomorrow, whatever, I have a few options, but if it were to die on me in 10 years time, would I still have those options? It's hard to say. All we know is how long these devices have lasted, and not how long they will last. You can make some educated guesses, but there's no way to know for sure until the day the TV dies. Which, given how old even the newest of CRTs are, the mass extinction of the tube can happen sooner than we think, unless enough technicians start coming out of the woodwork to do affordable and available repairs. I mean, you could service a tube yourself, but don't do that, seriously, you're screwing around with lethal mains electricity there's a reason why you get someone else to do it, unless you really know what you're doing. But I still think we should cherish and preserve them for as long as we can. There's just so much to love about them and the things they do for our favourite classics. And no matter how long they stick around for, it's been a privilege to grow up with these, starting just on the tail end of their popularity. I got to see the rise of LCDs and the fall of CRTs happen almost in direct parallel to each other for the first half of my life, so I had plenty of experience with both by the time I was 13 when I got my first LCD. So even back then, I was confident that these analog antiques just plainly looked better than their digital descendants. Fast forward almost a decade later, my mind has not changed on that one little bit. If anything, my feelings have only gotten stronger over those years of separation and rediscovery. Yes, they're big, heavy, loud and blurry boxes, but I wouldn't want to have it any other way.